going to start out, Dr. Unger, with a question for you. So, if we were to assume that the diversity action plans that the FDA was um, trying to put on, if if they actually occurred, how do you see yourself as a biostatistician potentially designing a study, understanding where patients are, and maybe incorporating some of those elements into the design of the study? Because I suspect that one of the reasons why the SWOG trials have been so successful, it's because the studies are in the places where the patients are, whereas the pharmaceutical sponsored studies do not represent that. How do you see that being a solution to addressing disparities?
I think it's a key solution, if not the fundamental solution, arguably. Um, the the evolution of cancer clinical research, um, you know, decades ago, maybe 50, 60 years ago, there was this, as it evolved, there was a sort of bedside to patient quality, and I'm talking, very early on, but that quickly transitioned to uh, cancer clinical research being conducted in large academic centers which have all of the resources. And it is, the more complicated and better the trials became, the more resource intensive they became. And so they tended to be focused on the large academic centers. Now, I think that there is actually a reverse trend that's going on now. We're trying to make trial conduct less burdensome. The pandemic itself forced the adoption of lots of decentralized clinical trial measures, like things like remote consent, remote monitoring, even allowing local providers to provide some aspects of care. Um, these are ways of trying to give the conduct of clinical trials back to the patients and the communities and community sites and make it easier for them to participate. Um, in my view, the NCI's National Community Oncology Research Program, the NCORE program, really does represent in part that model. It has this dedicated mission to bring the conduct of trials to minority, underserved, and now rural sites. And so you see better representation in those trials, and one can infer better access in general. Now those trials are saddled uh, as it compares to pharma anyway, by being having less being less remunerative, if you will, right? I mean, they don't provide the same sort of capitation rates and have the same backing behind them that pharmaceutical company sponsored trials do. But nonetheless, simply by the mechanism of better distributing access to those trials across a wider swath of the United States, you do have better access from a diverse set of patient groups.
Thank you so much. So I'll sort of follow up with Dr. Hetty and say, hey, so you just heard Dr. Unger say that pharmaceutical companies could adopt the same distribution model of clinical research. So clinical research is more democratic and more available instead of going back to the same places and your studies. How do you see that, and how do you think you could convince your enterprise, and not just your enterprise, but the entire pharmaceutical industry, which I'm going to sort of target another question, which is, why is it that pharma is not coming up with a consensus guideline like you have for interaction with, medical providers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think we are shifting the way that we're placing clinical trials and making clinical research available across the globe. I just presented around the 5 principles and how we're starting to think differently about where we're placing clinical trials and how we're offering clinical trials overall to patient populations. So I think we're trying to get better about this in terms of how do we convince others to sort of come along. So the 5 Ps that I just presented, we've submitted a draft manuscript on that because we want to show other pharmaceutical companies this is what you can do, this is what we've done as a best practice, and this is how we can sort of have all ships rise to the tide kind of thing. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And then repeat your second part of the question.
That why you doing this just as Genentech, not as all of Pharma?
Yeah.
You have the Pharma Council. Why don't you just all work together and come up with a consensus approach across the industry?
That's the plan. I think it's just going to take some time.
Why is it taking some time when it didn't take too much time to decide that, well, we are no longer going to provide alcohol at dinners, meetings. You could do the same thing.
I think that's more low-hanging fruit. But the idea is there. I mean, we do have a whole group around industry collaborations.
Yes.
So when there is interest, for example, we are trying to work on an initiative where we're trying to partner with other pharmaceutical companies to establish standards around inclusion and exclusion criteria.
It has to be standard.
Exactly.
So Dr. Guerra, so going on along that, using ASCO, I know, of course you're not ASCO, but I think ASCO has a unique ability to change a lot of behavior that maybe the government will never do. So we have to do this ourselves. And some of the ideas you heard about, maybe, using the drive score, for example. Why is that not a requirement that if you present at ASCO, you should start out by saying, my study has a drive score of 5, and then present the data? That could be done. What do you think?
It could be done. I don't know if everyone knows about the drive score, and that could be a barrier to moving in that direction. So better disseminating the drive score and perhaps evaluating the impact it has had on trial design, I think could get us there. But I agree with you, and that's certainly one of the innovations that I was referring to as part of the upcoming recommendations that we're looking for.
So please add that to the
I will.
recommendation. And so my next question is for you, Dr. Craig. As a statistician, you talked about your clients and maybe disseminating this language in a way that makes sense. One of the patients, and maybe, of course, you are not the one, but in terms of advising clients, how do you advise them so that the information can be more readily understood, so that patients who are ultimately the consumers of these agents that we prescribe can understand the data and also understand, because patients really don't know. Do our patients really know that they are not represented in clinical trials, that we're giving them drugs that have never been tested in them?
It's a difficult question because typically when you are interacting with the client, you are talking at the level of the client. I think if there are thoughts of relaying that information to the patient, that should certainly be brought up. But I think it's very difficult from my perspective. I'm not interacting with the patients, and so I don't know necessarily the concerns or hindrances that they have. And I'm sort of relying on the client that I'm talking to relay those. So it's very challenging.
Chadi, are you there?
Yes, right
Okay,
here.
so Chadi, I'm sure you'll be following these conversations.
Yeah.
Studies presented at ASCO is a SWOG study, and the diversity is reported, and you are the reviewer for JAMA Oncology to publish this simultaneously with the plenary session paper. And from what you've heard today, what would you be requiring to make sure that the information is disseminated in a way that the clinician, the patient, the lay public, and anyone else in the cancer space understands the meaning of this data vis-a-vis data transportability?
Yeah.
Remo, you never ask easy questions, but I like the fact, but I do like the fact that you're pushing everyone. That's your style, and that's the way we're going to move this forward. Just a couple of things. Look, you could be very drastic if you want to be extremely provocative, and there's a clinical trial that could have been that could have had more diverse patient population because it's a common disease. It's a disease that if the investigators have done an extra effort, or if the sponsor have done an extra effort, and there's more community outreach, potentially we could have a more diverse patient population in that trial. And you say, you know what? Sorry, but this is not going to get an oral presentation. It's not going to be on the plenary session. We're not going to give that exposure to a study that could have done better. And this will be more motivational, just literally on the highest stage of academic achievement, that in order for me to actually even do, it just pushes indirectly folks to do a better job. The second thing that you asked earlier, which is very, very challenging to answer, Remo, is where the clinical trial leads to a drug getting approved, and the inclusion-exclusion criteria of that particular study was a bit more restrictive, and then the drug becomes commercially available. The reality is the community at large is unlikely to go back and look at that detailed inclusion-exclusion criteria and not prescribe that drug unless you meet that particular criteria. I mean, there are many studies that will not allow you to enroll a patient unless the hemoglobin is 9 grams per deciliter. In clinical practice, if you see that patient with 8.7 grams per deciliter, you're unlikely to say, I'm not going to give you drug X because you did not meet the inclusion criteria of a hemoglobin of 9. And that's really where the disparity between really what we have in clinical trials and how physicians utilize the information and prescribe particular therapies to patients. A GFR of less than 60 is not allowed on trial X, and then you get a patient with a GFR of 50, and you're probably going to say, okay, well, I'm going to do this, and maybe I'll reduce the dose by 20% and a lot of arbitrary approach. So it is important that's why I believe in post-marketing trial. I believe in this real-world data. Let's try to better understand how these drugs, when they come to market, are being utilized by patient populations that are not being addressed in clinical trials, and let's learn from this so we can actually go back to the drawing board. So these are the two issues that hopefully responsive to you. Preventing some of these research studies that did not address disparities. But we have to be very careful. There are times where you just cannot do this because there are rare diseases that you are not going to see, let's say, in Black patients. It's not prostate cancer, it's not multiple myeloma, but there could be a particular disease. It could be that you don't see enough acute promyelocytic leukemia in patients who are, we know it's more in Hispanics, but not in Blacks, as an example. So we have to be realistic as we review the literature, and then try to have a path forward.
And be deliberate. So I'm going to kind of pull on everyone for 30 seconds each because we're short on time. So 30 seconds each. I have one suggestion. At ASCO, for example, maybe there should be an honorific award for the study that meets the most diversity every year. That could be something that at least would make people happy. And so that's my suggestion. Dr. Guerra.
I like your idea, and I'm thinking that since we're going to be doing that 15-site research site self-assessment, they're going to be going to look at their own clinical trials, and I'm wondering if they could identify the highest performers that are achieving that diversity and perhaps drill in deeper to understand what are the processes that they're using at their institution. And I think an institution site-specific approach may be better because then you're looking at the whole ecosystem of that institution, which may be different from next door, next state, or across the country. So I like your suggestion. I can bring that back to.
Dr. Craig.
I like it. I don't know what else to say to this. It's not an area that I've really thought about.
Dr. Hattie, of course, Novartis' study is now the number one. I'm sure you won't want that.
Well, I mean, I like the idea too, and I think obviously there's incentive, right, from a pharmaceutical industry perspective to make the studies as inclusive and as broad as possible, right, for all patient populations, because then your FDA label is going to reflect that. So I think I like the idea as well. I think it is a win-win for patients and from the industry side as well.
Jadi.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely. I mean, we are a population wherever we sit, we operate based on incentives, and I think incentivizing researchers, sponsors, and everyone involved, that by really putting a deliberate effort to making sure that these issues are addressed and the problems are mitigated, it's definitely going to have a major role. So absolutely, I mean, there's absolutely no downside to this, and there's everything, but lots of upside.
30 seconds. Dr. Unger, you finish the session.
Well, as it pertains to the idea of trying to incentivize sponsors to do better, I like the carrot approach that you outlined as opposed to the stick. The stick may have a role too. I just think it's important that studies be planned in advance to be diverse, rather than trying to somehow rectify it at the end of the day. There have been suggestions that, for instance, trials need to stay open longer to meet enrollment goals for subgroups. This has potentially adverse risks for the very populations you're trying to help, especially if there's a new drug that is potentially beneficial, but the trial is lingering as it tries to enroll subgroups of patients. I also think we have to protect against ideas like treating patients as commodities. And that can be a risk if you're trying to emphasize that you have to have a certain percentage of Group A and a certain percentage of Group B. There is a risk of bumping up against the U.S. common rule at that point, and I've heard this anecdotally from investigators and clinicians. And so the idea from my perspective is you have to go into the trial with a plan. And I know from sitting on steering committees at the NCI that they certainly do that. They ask pointedly, what is your plan for having diverse representation in your trial? And sometimes studies are not approved if there's a poor plan. So if you're going to use the stick, if you will, it should be at the outset. Make sure that sponsors have a plan going in, because it's hard to fix the trial later in an equitable way, in my view, or an efficient way, or a fair way. Make sure you have a plan, and I think that's what the FDA guidance has suggested. Have a plan going in, and I think that's really critical.
Thank you so much. So have a plan.
Can I just one? Yeah, can I? I like the idea of the plan. If
1 second.
Oh, sorry.
You got 5 seconds. Go.
I have 5 seconds only.
Yes.
Well, the plan has to include a couple of things. Remember, when you have a clinical trial, you've got two important parts: inclusion, exclusion criteria, and where the trial is going to open, as a sponsor or as a CRO. So let's open the trial in institutions and in practices that do serve many of underrepresented communities. That's very key, because these are the sites are going to serve the patient population that they serve. That's one. Inclusion, exclusion criteria have to be realistic. So if you're going to actually open this study and it's going to require 5 biopsies after cycle 1, which means the patient has to come 5 times and park 5 times in a parking garage that costs $25 a day, it's just not going to happen. The logistics. So ask the question, do I need actually 5 biopsies after a particular therapy? How much of this is actually needed versus a good thing that's going to make a graph in a paper I'm going to be able to get a high impact? So start asking practical questions that matters to patients as opposed to matters to papers.
Thank you. That was in like 5 seconds, but would appreciate you. So I would like to close this session. Thank you so much.